Hi everybody, hope you guys had a great weekend. We're going to just jump right into the lesson today. Today, if you guys remember on Friday, we talked about creating a two-way frequency table. Well, today we're going to talk about how to interpret those tables. Okay, so today we're going to talk about deciding whether there's an association between the data points that are in those tables. Okay, specifically we're talking about relative frequency. Relative frequency is the ratio of the number of times an event occurs to the total number of events. So in Friday's Explore activity, the relative frequency of bike owners who shop at the farmer's market is 36 out of 120, which is 30%. You can use relative frequency to decide if there's an association between two variables or events. So let's look at our first example here. It says determine whether there is an association between the events. Okay, so 100 teens were polled about whether they are required to do chores and whether they have a curfew. So they're talking about two things. Do you have chores or no? Do you have a curfew or no? Okay, and then what we want to do is we want to know if there's an association between having a curfew and having to do chores. So are these two things related? Okay, is somebody who has chores more likely to have a curfew or not? Okay, that's basically what we're trying to find. Okay, so step one here says find the relative frequency of having to do chores. Okay, now to find the relative frequency of having to do chores, we're going to take the total who have to do chores. So we're going to look at the chores row right here. The total number of those teenagers that are doing chores is 20. We're going to do that over the total number of teens polled. Well, the total number of teens polled is 100. So 20 over 100 is 1/5, which is 20%. So 20% of the teens polled have to do chores. Okay. Now, step two says find the relative frequency of having to do chores among those who have a curfew. So now we're only looking at the students that are doing chores, okay? Or sorry, only looking at the students that have a curfew. And we want to know of those students who have a curfew if they have to do chores or not. Okay, so now the number with a curfew who have chores. So we're looking at this number right here. The reason we're looking at this number is because these students have both chores and a curfew. So that's 16 students have chores and a curfew. And then we're going to put that over the total number of students with a curfew. Now we don't want the total number of students here. We just want the total number of students with a curfew. That's this right here. So 16 over 32. 16 over 32 can reduce to 1/2, which is 50%. Okay? Now, how can we interpret this? We can see that out of the total number of students, only 20% of the total students have to do chores. But if we look at the ones that have a curfew, 50% of the students with a curfew have to do chores. That's a lot more, right? We know that 50% is a lot greater than 20%. So what we can say is, if we're going to compare these relative frequencies, students are more likely to have to do chores if they have a curfew rather than not have a curfew. Make sense? Okay? Because these students are the ones with a curfew. They're a lot more likely to have to do chores than the general population of students. Okay? That's how we can interpret that. All right. Part B, data from 200 flights were collected. So we got 200 total flights collected. The flights were categorized as domestic or international and late or not late. So a lot of times the flight could be running on time or it could be running late. Is there an association between international flights and a flight being late? Okay, so first let's find the relative frequency of a flight being late. Okay, so the total number of flights that are late is going to go on top over the total number of flights. So the total number of flights that are late. Okay, here's our late category right here. We want to look at this column and the total number of flights that are late. That's 40. Out of the total number of flights, that's 200. There's 200 total flights. we can then reduce our fraction to 1/5, which is, again, 20%. Okay, so 20% of the total number of flights end up being late. Okay, step 2. We want to compare that with the relative frequency of a flight being late among international flights. Okay, so the number of international flights that are late, here's international. The number of international flights that are late are 10. And then the total number of international flights is 50. Okay, 10 out of 50 reduces to 1/5, which is 20%. Okay, so what we see here now is our relative frequencies are exactly the same. Since they're exactly the same, we can say, yeah, I don't think that international flights are more or less likely to be late than any other type of flight. Okay, international flights are just as equally likely to be late as domestic flights. Okay, that's how we can interpret this data. Okay. All right, what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead and I want you to try this one on your own. Okay, see if you can figure this one out. So data from 200 middle school and high school students were collected. Students were asked whether or not they had visited at least one national park. Okay, is there an association between being a high school student and visiting a national park? Okay, so see if you can figure out what the relative frequency of visiting a national park is, then figure out what the relative frequency is of being a high school student who visits a national park, and then compare them. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video and see if you can find these two relative frequencies, and then I'll help you here in a second. Okay, so first, the relative frequency of visiting a national park. Okay, well, the total number of students is 200, so that's going to go on the bottom here. The total number of students that have visited a national park then is 105. So 105 out of 200. Okay, let's use a calculator to see if we can figure out what this percent is. So we're going to do 105 divided by 200. That's about 53%. So it's approximately 53%. Okay. Now we want to know if there is a higher or lower or equal probability that a high school student has visited a national park, right? So the relative frequency of a high school student visiting a national park. Okay, so high school student, there's a total of 120 high school students that were polled. 80 of them have visited a national park. So 80 out of 120 gives us a percent. We need to divide here. So 80 divided by 120 gives us about 67%. Now we can compare these two probabilities. We can see high schoolers are much more likely to have visited a national park than the general population of students. So we can say, yeah, high school students probably more likely to have visited a national park. Okay. All right, that's it for today. Your assignment now is on your HRW. It's the 15.1 homework. You can go ahead and get started on that. Just a reminder that on Wednesday we will have a live Q&A on Canvas. If you have any questions over this assignment or any other assignment we've done, feel free to come by at 1 p.m. on Canvas on Wednesday and ask any questions that you have. We'll see you guys later. Bye.